My name is Neil Cooper. As Dean said, I'm a founding partner of Royer Cooper Cohen Braunfeld. We're a growing 14-lawyer firm based in the region. We are proud to be a sponsor once again, and we're a group of entrepreneurs working with and for other entrepreneurs. We offer a full suite of services from business transactions, commercial litigation, real estate, trust and estates, tax transactions, and we continue to be bullish about the tech and emerging growth community in the region. It's my pleasure to introduce this first panel, with investment insights from top VC hotbeds. They're going to be talking about what's trending in venture investment from an esteemed panel of venture capitalists representing Silicon Valley and Boston and other places, including New York. Together with the Metro New York and DC regions, they account for over 70% of venture capital invested in the US. The panelists will share insights on the current state of their region and why Philadelphia is an interesting place to look for deals. With that, I'd like to introduce Zach Seward, Editor-in-Chief of Technically, who will be moderating today's panel. Thank you very much.
All right. Hi there, how you doing? Good, good. My name's Zach Seward. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Technically, and we're a network of news and event sites out of Philly, but we cover Brooklyn, Delaware, Baltimore, and DC as well. I wanted to get everybody up from the panel to join me and grab a seat, and then I will be introducing each person individually. Panelists, please come on down. And you know what? Give them a round of applause. Why not? So the thing that I want to do in this panel is really get a great outside perspective on the Philadelphia venture market. These are folks who know the place but are based elsewhere, and they're going to be able to share some really great insights on what's going on. So I'm going to start at the far. I'm going to start here actually. This is Matt Withheiler with Flybridge Capital Partners. He's based in New York. Next to him is Jeff Williams, who is with Spring Lake Equity Partners in Boston. Seated next to him is John Simon, who's the managing director of Sigma Prime Ventures, also in Boston. Next up, Louis Toth, who is with Comcast Ventures. He splits his time between here and Silicon Valley. Next up, Shamez Kanji, who's a general partner at North Hill Ventures in Boston. And last, and certainly not least, is Philip Elliott, who is a managing director at Paladin Capital Group, which is based in Washington, D.C. And I was talking with these guys beforehand just to get kind of the same page on what we're all going to talk about, and I was struck by one thing in particular. So I wanted to go down the line, starting here, ending all the way up Philip. I wanted to ask them, when was the last time they made an investment in a Philadelphia area-based company? So, when was the last time you did that?
Does never count?
I don't know if never counts, but we'll get that out there on the record. Never.
Never for me.
Working on one right now.
Working on one?
Okay. Never made an investment in a Philadelphia-based company. However, two companies I've been involved with have been bought by Philadelphia-based companies. So one, Outstart, was bought by Conexa, which in turn was bought by IBM. And another one was bought by GSI Commerce, which in turn was bought by eBay. So I guess buying one of our companies is a good thing.
Okay.
So within our group of funds, we've got a couple. One is Lead ID, which is invested by Genicast as well as by ourselves, and there are a few others that we're still working on.
Unfortunately, I'm part of the never cohort. Last time we got close was in 2006, but we are very open to making investments in Philadelphia.
Our last investment here my last investment was in 2005, exited in 2006, and it was actually a very successful exit, but unfortunately haven't found another one since then.
Got it. So I'm hearing a lot of nevers, a lot of 5-10 years ago. I guess my biggest question, just to kind of channel some Dangerfield here, what's up with the lack of respect? Why is Philly getting no respect in the national venture capital scene? What's going on? What are we missing? Why aren't you guys flocking here in droves and investing in our companies? Philip, you want to take that?
Sure. I don't think there's a specific reason why we're not, I would say. I observe our deal flow and the companies I see, and we haven't seen a lot of companies from Philadelphia. We've seen them all up and down the eastern seaboard, all up and down the west coast. but there hasn't been a lot of deal flow, at least in our firm, from Philadelphia. Partly that may be the sector. I'm very focused on enterprise software, and what I see around Philadelphia is a very strong med tech community, but not as strong in enterprise software. We just haven't seen the quantity of deals.
I mean, tell me about another market that may be doing something right. You look at a place like Atlanta or a place like New York City, which even, you know, a handful of years ago wasn't the bee's knees in terms of venture capital investment. What are other markets doing right in attracting outside investors such as yourselves?
I can speak to Atlanta just for a moment. So our firm is based in Boston. The heaviest concentration of investment is Boston and New York, but we have other pockets of activity. And Atlanta, we made our first investment maybe about 15 years ago in a company called ISS that ended up becoming very, very successful, bought by, it was a security software company. Software is where we focus as well. And this was a company that was bought by IBM for close to $2 billion. And then what happened is a series of the executives went and started their own companies. And as they started their own companies, there was also angel funding from other folks within the ISS community, and then venture folks followed. You know, lo and behold, 10 years later, we have 6 portfolio companies down in Atlanta. Our second exit is a company that was bought about a year ago by Cisco. So it's a very successful and thriving ecosystem. And I think, one message about that would be, all you need is a couple of real pillar companies that grow to be very, very successful and actually grow the entrepreneur bases within their ranks. And frankly, there'll be more and more activity in a given geography. We've seen this time and time again.
We're also actively down in Atlanta, and I would second what John said. If you look at the other components that have made Atlanta grow very quickly over the last few years, it wasn't institutional capital. There was actually a shortage of venture capital down there, and so funds like us from DC, like Sigma from Boston, ended up being the funding sources. So lack of capital didn't deter it, but they had great universities that were producing talent. Obviously, Philadelphia has that in droves. So I think Philadelphia has a lot of the same pieces. I would agree with John. What it hasn't had is the big, visible enterprise software exits that are also the training grounds for the next round of entrepreneurs and senior executives that come out.
I was just going to say that
Jump in, Matt.
from my perspective, I think some of the gems and some of the great companies in Philadelphia are actually hidden from kind of my view. And the reason they're hidden is because New York is an hour and 10 minutes away, which is the same distance between Palo Alto and San Francisco. And so although from a deal flow perspective, I don't see a lot of companies that originate here in Philadelphia, I do see a lot of companies that relocate or place management teams in New York. And it's just accessibility of capital, kind of larger talent pool that drags people to New York. But I think to think of Philadelphia as a kind of tier 2 or tier 3 market is wrong, because you're so close to a leading venture capital market.
How do you, reap some of the benefits of proximity then? If it's probably not the venture capitalists' prerogative to make stronger communities up and down the East Coast and cities that aren't New York, but how do you reap some of the benefits of that sort of that proximity that you mentioned there? How do you think Philadelphia should go about doing that?
So from my perspective, I think it's just hopping on the train and getting up to New York as frequently as you can, and not necessarily requiring for first meetings, expecting venture capitalists to come to you. Go out there and pound the pavement in New York, get somebody on the hook, and then bring them to Philadelphia for kind of the diligence, the work. And there's no problem with basing a company and building it here. There's tons of great academic universities and tons of great talent. It's just a matter of being proactive about tapping into the resource that seriously is an hour and 10 minutes away from you. It's really close.
I guess, for the entrepreneurs in the room, I wouldn't even worry about what city you're from. I mean, that's just not something that enters into our calculations at all. We invest in companies and people. We don't invest in cities and geographies. And so I don't know why in our deal flow there isn't more of a presence from Philadelphia. We're very focused on financial services, financial technology. There hasn't been a large base of either large companies or successful entrepreneurial companies that have emerged from here. But just one example from our portfolio is we made an investment a year ago in a company in Salt Lake City. This company makes software for banks. There's not a big banking community in Salt Lake City. Zion's Bancorp is the biggest bank out there. But one thing that there was a very strong, successful angel community. Omniture was a very successful company based in Salt Lake City. Went public, was a big success. And so there were angels in that community who were willing to give back, who liked early stage companies, and frankly provided a lot of early funding to a dozen different companies in the Salt Lake area. then like John and Phil, once we made our first investment in Salt Lake City, suddenly you're part of that ecosystem yourself, and through no benevolence, because venture guys generally aren't benevolent. When you're there, you want to do more. I'm taking the flight out there anyway, or if I was down here in Philadelphia today, I want to fill up my day with other things to do. So you network in with the lawyers, the accountants, the entrepreneurial community, and we found our way to a second investment opportunity that we have under term sheet right now. So I think what Matt said is very true. It's like, okay, if for whatever reason your sector is getting overlooked in Philadelphia, you're going to have to hustle more. You're going to have to get on a plane, go up to Boston, go to San Francisco, avoid New York if you can. But in general, good companies, venture guys want to invest in good companies, and it doesn't matter where they are, is my perception at least.
Yeah, I think there's also some historical perspective that might be useful here. So there were a number of companies in the 2000 timeframe that were successful. And those are names that are probably not as well remembered, but you had Vertical Net, and you had ICG, and you had a few others. And the flywheel didn't start turning, unfortunately, where some of those entrepreneurs then went on and started the next generation of companies and the next and so forth. And so I think that we are a little bit back to square one in Philadelphia, and we need to make sure that we do have some of those successes. To answer your question about geography, I do think also that finding, so we're investors in a local company here called Lead ID, very successful, and they had opportunities to take money from other capital sources, but our partner who's focused on it really likes to do a lot of hands-on work with their portfolio companies. The CEO wanted to stay in the area and resisted attempts by other funding sources to move him out of the area. So I think if you're earnest about, as an entrepreneur, about building a company here, stick to your guns and stay here. Don't necessarily move up to New York or up to Boston or down to DC. And there is the technical talent here if you're looking for that.
Yeah, I'm curious about your perspective, Louis. What does the landscape look like from a Comcast, which is obviously a defining company here in the Philadelphia region, in terms of tech entrepreneurship, especially in the IT space? What are you seeing that's exciting to you right now?
Yeah, so it is. I think it is a pretty vibrant community, but as Matt says, you have to look a little bit harder. Like a lot of things in Philadelphia, it doesn't just all hang out there. You got to do a little bit of research, and once you find it, there's some good nuggets. So I'd love to do more in the Philadelphia area. I'd love not to be schlepping to California, 2,500 miles every other week. So we'd love to see. We don't do medical devices or anything in the healthcare space, but certainly, or as much in the healthcare space, but certainly enterprise software and networking and content and consumer internet are all interesting areas for us. So as far as I'm concerned, I swear I'm not doing anything.
Yeah, we're having a little bit of a spotty mic issue, so start flailing around if you can't hear people, just start waving your arms, and I'll try to make sure we get something fixed. But you're coming in and out.
So just to answer real quickly. So we think that there are nuggets of talent. There's certainly a lot of talent around media, and let me just take this off. There's certainly a lot of talent around media and entertainment through Comcast. There's actually a fair amount in the technology domain as well, which is multi-purpose. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
And I think we should we should play to those strengths. I've been looking at a fair amount of stuff in the television technology space and internet video and so forth, which are all pretty hot areas. So let's my advice to the Philadelphia entrepreneurial community is try to be best. Try to stick to your knitting. Try to do the things that you're best at, and then you can build an expertise from there.
John, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. You have some experience in an area that I think Philadelphia is genuinely seeing some positive movement around in the social entrepreneurship space. You've had some experience there. If you could share that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I've had a couple of different experiences with Philadelphia going back now about 20 years. So 20 years ago, I brought or helped bring the first nonprofit I was involved in called the Stepping Stone Foundation here in the form of the Stepping Stone Scholars Program. And then recently, about 3 years ago, brought a second nonprofit here called the Greenlight Fund. And both of those organizations are social entrepreneur organizations that are doing nonprofit things for the inner city and helping in a very significant way. And what we've seen is a very vibrant community of entrepreneurs, the kinds of folks that hang out at incubators and accelerators, getting involved in these endeavors and becoming mentors and coaches to the social entrepreneurs and really making things happen here in the city. And it's given me a bit of perspective because Stepping Stone was brought here in, I think, 94 or 95, whereas Greenlight was brought here in 2012. And I'm seeing a vibrancy, now that I hadn't seen before. I do think, it's going to take a few years before these end up becoming pillar companies. But I think that vibrancy is, critical to the renaissance that's possible here over the next 5 to 10 years.
When you talk about some big exits, right? Sort of seeding that next generation of angels and executives who know how to get a company to that level. What can sort of the corollary, the support infrastructure in an area like Philadelphia, what organizations should and can be helping as it relates to boosting up that next great company? Are there any resources that need to be channeled here?
Can I just mention a couple? So I think,
absolutely.
One of the things we're seeing in Boston is the power of shared working space. So literally, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square feet now in downtown Boston that's devoted to shared working space for IT startups, software startups. And this has made the city an incredibly attractive place to work. So it's no longer Route 128 or Cambridge where the hot startup companies are locating, or even coming from Europe to locate. It's downtown Boston. And obviously there's a bunch of space like that here and more on its route. I mean, I think that is critical infrastructure because the other thing is Philadelphia has the ability to attract companies here. The other thing is angels, which were talked about, because the stats, sort of nationwide, I think there'll be about $25 to $30 billion invested in venture capital nationwide in the US this year. According to most studies, the angel capital deployed in startup companies will be roughly equivalent to that, which is astonishing. But based on some numbers I saw recently in Philadelphia, those numbers might be, let's say $600, $700 million of venture capital this year, and maybe, $40 or $50 million of angel capital. So the ratio isn't quite where you'd like it to be. In Boston, just to give an example, this year there'll be about $4 billion of venture capital deployed, and there'll be a similar amount of angel money deployed, which is astonishing. So I think that both those things, shared working space and the angel community, angel investment, really, there's a lot of things that could structurally happen to help make that happen here.
I think another thing that really can help the ecosystem here is if you look at the data, which we did last time, we did a kind of research report to figure out where the entrepreneurial hubs in New York were coming from. And we specifically looked at it from a school sort of slice. And so if you look at the schools that are generating startups in New York, you would expect Columbia or NYU to be like the #1 startup hub for the New York ecosystem. But the truth was, it was Penn. So Penn was generating more startups in New York per year than either Columbia or NYU, so the endemic schools. And for us, that was a really interesting insight, which suggested we should get on the train more often and be spending more time down here. And I think what you see happening is you see students who are kind of leaving the community upon graduation or upon coming up with an idea because they feel like they can't access the resources here. And I think one thing that the community potentially could do is be more supportive or figure out infrastructure sorts of programs, whether it's shared working spaces or easier access to mentorship programs that keep them here, because I'm going to go where to the point made earlier, I'm going to go where the deals are. And so if the deals are here, I'm going to be coming down here. But today we see a lot of those companies coming to New York.
Jamez, I saw you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, so one example I'll give you from Boston as well is, so large companies really do want to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem in their cities. And Fidelity Investments in Boston realized that there are a lot of analytics companies in town that just the cost of purchasing data to test their analytical models was too high for startup companies. And so starting off with their own data, they have recently put together a consortium of 5 or 6 companies nationwide who are all donating free data to this consortium. Analytics companies can use that data for free as long as they're bona fide as startups. They can help with the data by building APIs and showing the larger companies how value can be extracted from that data. And then there's a kind of a glide path going to commercial licensing as the company develops. Now that's being managed out of the Devonshire investment side of Fidelity, but they didn't come up with that idea themselves. It was actually a couple of entrepreneurs in the community who came to them and said, look, this is a problem, you're really big, how can you help us solve this problem? And it took a year, like everything does, but it worked itself out. So, you know, that's a very vertically based solution that obviously only works for certain companies in the Boston environment. But I would think that way in this town, you know, the Comcasts of the world, the other large companies in Philadelphia, the hospitals, what can they offer to startups in your specific vertical? And then go ask them for it. And you're not going to get a really quick answer, at least based on our experience with large companies. But by and large, they're very willing to help, and they will work with you if they can to provide you with something that could be of real value.
Yeah. And so just, you know, following up on that, you know, there are a lot of resources. Obviously, you know, events like this, you've got the Ben Franklin Technology Group, and then you've got, you know, a number of different incubators around town. You've got Dream It, with which we've got a relationship as well. So tapping into those networks as an entrepreneur, I think, is really key. There's a lot of the foundation that is here, and then those people, you know, can bubble up and find the Josh Koppelmans of the world, or find us, and so forth. You know, Comcast has been making a commitment around innovation. I think some of you probably see that they've broken ground on the new building on JFK, 18th and JFK, and you know, you'll see that you know, as part of that, there's going to be incubator space, and there'll be you know, a way for entrepreneurs to receive mentoring and so forth. So there are some of these things. Again, you've got to sort of hunt and peck and find some of them, and maybe they're not as much in the forefront as they should be.
John, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, it's a little bit sort of under-recognized, but something Matt said. I mean, the stakes for keeping great entrepreneurs in the community, you know, can be very, very high because of the importance of these pillar companies. And just urge a community to think about anything it can do to hold on to these great companies and nurture them within the community, as opposed to having them move. So just to pick the Boston example, you know, in the last 18 months, we've seen, you know, about $8 or $9 billion of public market cap value from companies going public, like Wayfair, HubSpot, Imprivata, Brightcoat, Demandware, et cetera. But two companies that started in Boston and could have stayed in Boston were Facebook and Dropbox. Okay, and they just decided, well, you know, we're going to up and move to the valley. So as, you know, powerful as that ecosystem has developed in Boston, and, you know, no sort of regrets about it, I mean, think about how powerful it would be even if those companies had stayed. And they could have stayed, and they could have built. And so I think that is an opportunity here, you know, again, over the next 5 to 10 years.
And it's not just a problem that, you know, as you said, Philadelphia experiences, but, you know, you look at New York too. As great of a market as that is, you know, you see Series A done in New York, maybe Series B, but if it's a really big round, often, you know, those startups are going west to some of the really large funds.
Jeff, I'm curious on your perspective here. Talk to me about sort of the chicken and the egg thing that we have going on here, right? Because entrepreneurs are fleeing to where the investors are. Investors, in turn, are fleeing to where the entrepreneurs are. Who's leading that dance, if anyone, and how do you know, for a city like Philadelphia, you know, let's posit that there's more entrepreneurs here than investors. How do you tilt that dance in your favor?
I'm not so sure that anyone's leading that dance. I mean, I think we sort of said it before. We go to where the deals are. That said, I think all of us sort of sit here and say we'd rather find a deal that's quote unquote off the beaten track, because it means more likely we're not going to see one of the people on the panel here at it. That's what it's all about. But in reality, and you've seen it with some of the companies that have had healthy exits within the Philadelphia region, with Health Advocate, Sev1, which is still kind of continuing, obviously. They've been really built up without the help of financial investors per se. So that speaks to the quality of the individuals and the entrepreneurs that are here and the work base that's here. So you can do it. It's really incumbent on us to sort of find other folks like that, or how do you build upon those success has been generated. So I don't feel like it's necessarily a dance as more as a get to know. It's a first date. We
First
both need to
date,
get to
okay.
know each other.
Maybe lead to something a little more heavy is what you're saying, basically, right? So I guess that's an interesting point that you bring up. The idea of identifying a promising entrepreneur in a secondary market, in a way, sort of represents potentially bigger returns for firms such as yours. Is the venture capital industry seeing more interest in traveling to far-off places and looking at different markets? Shemaz, John?
Investor, you don't have a choice. There's not very many dense markets on the East Coast, Boston being the notable exception. And so I think if you're on the East Coast, you're on a plane all the time, and that means finding those overlooked companies. We've had one of our most successful exits in Columbia, South Carolina. It's not that the entrepreneur needs to be in a hotbed market. They just need to be somehow able to find us, or we to find them. And so to your question of is the entrepreneur first or the capital first, I'll compare two markets, Atlanta and Washington, D.C., where I'm from. Washington had a great market, much like Philadelphia at the height of the bubble. When I started in '99, we had high-flying billion-dollar companies everywhere, and we never recovered from the bubble collapse. So we had billions of dollars of venture capital money, and really very few successful exits until the last few years, so about a 10-year period. Atlanta, you had no capital, and yet because of ISS, because of others, you were able to spark an ecosystem where you had a density of companies around a single theme there. And I think that's key. So if you say which comes first, the money or the companies, no doubt the entrepreneur comes first, and we will chase entrepreneurs wherever they are. But then the question is, when a market becomes dense enough that you're saying, hey, when I'm going down to Atlanta, I'm going to have 3 days of meetings because there's so many great companies, as opposed to I'm going to Columbia, South Carolina. There's one great company I want to see, but I'm probably not going to find another one. And Philadelphia to me right now is in the second category, which is there's some interesting companies here, no doubt, but you don't view it as a dense, rich ecosystem that you want to say, hey, how can I spend 3-4 days up there and meet everyone?
And let me go back to something you said just briefly. You said that it's about entrepreneurs finding you. What, at the risk of just totally blowing up your spot and really inviting a lot of awful emails and phone calls, what are a few tips that you can give to people in this room about finding investors such as yourself?
Well,
what works?
First of all, it's really easy. If I go back to '99, it was not as easy. You didn't have as much social networking and so forth. Right now, the dirty little secret is we want to meet entrepreneurs, right? We succeed only because we meet great entrepreneurs. So we want you to call us. And there's, it's better if you research and say, hey, this is a firm that fits what I'm doing, so that call is appropriate. You're going to look much better if you have done some research about us and said, hey, this is why I'm a good fit for you. But we absolutely look at a lot of inbound deal flow. To state the obvious, it's better if there's references and so forth, and someone that's, and if you send me I got one the other day that was a restaurant, right? I do software. I'm not going to answer that email, but for the most part, if you're in the right sector, and particularly if you've networked your way to us, you're going to get a response. And it's easier to do that now than it was 15 years ago.
Just from the Flybridge perspective, we have 60-something portfolio companies, and I don't think any came through a blind email to us. In fact, I can say categorically, none of our investments were emails that just came to us randomly. It was always through a connection or through a trusted advisor or somebody we'd done business before with. And so the biggest piece of advice I can give anybody in the room who's looking for venture money is to figure out, first off, what investors are a fit for your profile, and then figure out a way to get to somebody who knows that investor and target an individual and say, and it's even better if multiple people are telling me, hey, you should check out this company. That is the strongest piece of advice I can give.
Yeah, I think two really simple things. One is if there are other companies in your sector that you view as real beacons, not a direct competitor, but something adjacent that's further ahead than you, that's notably doing very well, go see who the investors in that company were, because they're the guys whose your story could potentially resonate the most with. And then use LinkedIn. It's just an incredible tool for figuring out, your point of connection to someone else you don't know. And it's incredible just coming in through someone's trusted network, how easy it is to do, and the success with doing that versus the success with cold calling. So I agree, success with cold calling is basically zero. We don't answer unsolicited emails or calls. But if something comes through someone that we know a little bit, we're much more, we're totally open to looking at those things.
Right. I mean, the only thing I would add to expand on that is that, the introduction, if it comes from somebody that, mutually knows each of us, okay, that's one thing. But if that person is actually involved in the company, they're an advisor, they're a board member, they're an angel investor, they're spending their time and their money on the project, and they think it's a great project, and they introduce it to us. That's all the more meaningful. So points of connection, yes, but something that we see that's not done as much as it should be is an entrepreneur that has a great idea, building his or her advisory team, his or her board, his or her mentor group, his or her angel supporters. That's a real important foundation for companies these days. And those introductions are taken way, way more seriously than just I know somebody who knows somebody. And there's a lot of advantages, again, to being a company that's not in one of these overrun locations. For starters, it just hasn't been mentioned on the panel, but everybody would mention it, I'm sure. Being able to build a culture and hold on to people, in the valley, people are staying places 6 to 9 months, 12 months, and if Facebook's going to make a run at an engineer, you don't have a chance of maintaining that person. So you can actually build cultures and teams here and really build quality companies in a way that's not possible in some of these overrun geographies. It's a big advantage.
I think another reason that investors are attracted, in addition to the fact that retention of talent is better, is that because of the competitive landscape in some of these other markets, specifically California, deal prices get bid up very high, and companies end up raising potentially more money than the investors think they should be raising at higher prices than really early stage investors like us are able to accommodate. And when you start talking about places like Philadelphia or Atlanta, you have the opportunity as an investor to work more closely with the entrepreneur and set more reasonable terms when it comes to pricing, because the market is maybe less competitive in these regions.
So I think one thing, Zach, is it's interesting because the two themes that we've been playing on in some ways have a tension between them, because I agree, we love deals in overlooked markets for all the same reasons that Matt and John just mentioned. But what we were also just talking about is just the importance of network, helping build the profile of your company and helping get you access to capital and other things. And I think that is a problem as an entrepreneur in a secondary market, because by definition, there's just more network where there have already been more successful companies. So I don't underestimate how hard that is to navigate. And I do think also, we're all very open to investing in other geographies, but you don't have anyone on the panel from a really large, brand name West Coast fund, and they're not. We've seen 3 companies from Boston, early stage companies that, Khosla in one case, Axel in one case, and Greylock in one case, which is particularly funny because Greylock used to be a Boston fund. They've invested in these companies on the condition that they move out west, and they kind of have the power to do that, because who's going to say, yeah, I won't move out there? And they come up with their rationales. But the reality is they just like all their portfolio companies really close, because that's easier to manage, and by and large, people are willing to go along with that. So it's going to take a little while to break that flywheel of the Valley in San Francisco. I think it will happen eventually, but as an entrepreneur, you have to be careful about those dynamics.
There is another model too, though, and we just helped start a company. We had an entrepreneur in residence who was with us, and we started a company. The company is based in Silicon Valley, but the technology team is in Ottawa, and really all the employee base at this point is pretty much in Ottawa, except for a couple people in the Valley. So it's important to have that presence in the Valley to be able to build that story, to be able to build the connections with the VCs and so forth. So Philadelphia could certainly, start off by playing that role. Israel started off very much in that role, where you had companies that, from a tech team perspective, started there, but then they quickly learned you needed to have an outpost either in New York, Boston, or Silicon Valley. So there is a way to thread that needle. It's not easy operating a company, obviously, in multiple locations, but there's a reasonable tech talent pool here where you could sort of play a development role first.
Got it. We've got about a half hour left. I definitely want to give 10, 15 minutes of audience questions. So if you have any questions, jot them down. We're going to make some time available for that. I did want to go back to something I think John said earlier about the venture versus angel gap or chasm in a market like Philadelphia. Assuming that that's a very important part of the pipeline here, how do you go about getting more angel investors in a place like Philadelphia? What's the secret to expanding that pool of people who are making those early stage investments in potentially promising companies?
I raised the issue. I don't have the answer.
Solve all the
Yeah,
problems.
I mean, it's to some extent, I mean, it is being addressed a little bit. I mean, I had a summer intern this past summer, brilliant young guy worked with me. One of the projects he had was to identify incubators and accelerators all over the East Coast, and call them and make sure that they were aware that Sigma Prime had closed a fund recently, had plenty of capital availability. This is what we did. This is how successful our companies were. This is how we worked with entrepreneurs. We were all former entrepreneurs. He identified like hundreds of incubators and accelerators in places I had no idea. I mean, Chicago, New York. I mean, just New York, there were like 3 times as many incubators and accelerators as I would have thought. And there was handfuls down here. So I think that's one thing. I think that encouraging people to get together and pool their capital and form angel groups. There is an entity up in Boston called, I think it's called, no, not Common Angels. I was going to say, I think it's Launch Angels or something, where it's a platform where they can do all the back office of like an angel group and help an angel group create a venture firm. So I think it's basically where people could get together and build communities and sort of encouraging that.
So I think Philadelphia has the capital. I mean, there's, especially out in the suburbs, there are lots of family offices, lots of private wealth management firms, lots of family money and so forth. The main difference I see between the angel community in the Valley and here is that here I don't think the folks necessarily, to use the term, grok the ideas, right? They don't necessarily really grasp or want to take the risk associated with technology, early stage technology investments. Whereas in the Valley, these people made their money from those sorts of deals. They understand the risk. They understand the problems that an entrepreneur will be going through and can act as a sounding board. Here, it's either it's family money or it's industrial money or it's professionals and so forth. And so there isn't necessarily that same tangible feel for that entrepreneurial venture and the risk associated with it.
I go further than saying it's just the feel for it, but there also needs to be some kind of positive reinforcement socially. And I think if you look at what happened in New York, you look at the Valley, there's almost a peer pressure to an angel invest and an honor in angel investing. And so you see folks who really don't have the financial means necessarily to take that kind of risk being drawn into it because it's part of what you do, and it's sort of a status symbol in some ways. And I think in New York for a little while it was kind of a hot thing to be an angel investor. What portfolio companies are you involved in? Different family offices got into it. I think in DC and Philadelphia, there's never been that excitement, that reason that says, hey, I'm going to tell my buddies I'm an angel investor. It just doesn't. It's not cool, for lack of a better term, but it seems there's no social
Valley,
pressure.
It's part of giving back to the community.
Yeah.
I was a successful entrepreneur, and therefore, and someone reached out their hand and helped me, so therefore I'm going to do it. So there's a certain
But the money
element to
that's
that.
made in Philadelphia or Washington typically wasn't made in those kinds of companies, and so there's not the same reach back to those entrepreneurs, I don't think.
Well, the other way to think about it too is, okay, so here if there's a large base of people who've made their money with early stage investing, that's obviously your best base for entrepreneurs. Think about the domain that you're operating in, because I just invest in financial services and financial technology companies. The best investors as angels in our companies are people who've made their money in banking or people who made their money at Visa or MasterCard. So, if you're starting up a business that is a drug for cancer and you think it's good, try and get angel money from oncologists because they'll understand what you're talking about better than the average rich person on the street. If you're starting up a consumer car buying site, go to a family that made a lot of their money in auto dealerships for the same reason. People are generally much more comfortable investing in areas where they understand the problem you're trying to address and they can validate the solution that you've come up with.
And I'll go back to a point I made earlier, which is you are an hour and 10 minutes away by train from a lot of these people. And so get out there, and if they're not in Philadelphia, identify where they are in New York, in Boston, in some of the markets where they may be playing that are very accessible to you, and go spend time there. Because even with a warm introduction, the chances of me flying down for a first meeting in Philadelphia are much, much, much lower than if it's a warm introduction and the company says, and I happen to be in in New York in the next 2 weeks. Do you have time to get together? I will more often than not take that meeting. Whereas the other side is, I'll either, if the meeting is required to be here, I'll either do a phone call, which is never as effective, or if it's not totally in scope with us, won't pursue the opportunity.
If I could take this in a slightly different direction. So I think the other, just thinking about the flywheel and how to get things started. There are obviously lots of great institutions of higher learning in the Philadelphia area, and college students are poor. They don't mind risking everything. It's okay to do a startup, right? So getting to those folks early on, I do some guest lectures over at Wharton, and talking to the undergraduates especially is really, really exciting. These are folks that have lots of ideas. The world's their oyster, and they're ready to go out and conquer something. So I think part of it is also getting the angel community and the mentoring community tied in to those people, to those students, and they don't necessarily have all the preconceived notions that someone who's a more experienced entrepreneur might have about how do they position their company with these VCs, or how do they get to that person at Greylock or Andreessen or so forth. They don't know. They're just there, and they'll take all the help they can get. So I think if there's one insertion point, that's certainly a pretty good one that Philadelphia has a lot going for it.
Yeah, and Matt, it's reminding me of just this stunning factoid you gave about Penn seeding the most startups in New York City, and I think I don't know what the question is. I'm still struck by that, but if that's the point at which we think we can maybe move the needle, and I'm asking you to put on your Philadelphia booster hat, how would you go about making sure more of those people out of Penn stick around and make the next great company here?
I think the challenge is that a lot of the students who are starting companies end up feeling like they have to go to New York, or they have to go to Boston, they have to go to San Francisco to raise money. And so I think, to the earlier discussion, building a community of advisors and investors in the local economy, and bringing investors here to meet with those companies is probably the way to keep them around. And Boston faces this challenge too, around people certainly 10 years ago or 15 years ago felt like that they could not build a big company in Boston. That's why they end up moving. And so a lot of markets face this challenge, and I think the way to mitigate it is to make sure that you're doing everything you can at that early stage level to convince people that they can build great companies here. And nothing proves that like having a great company.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've seen with some other markets is alumni angel groups. To address two of the questions we've raised here. One is, how do you keep young undergrads staying in the community, and the other is, how do you create angel money? I'll point at University of Maryland has a group led by Kevin Plank, who founded Under Armour. And they've got a number of wealthy alums, and any school around Philadelphia is going to have a number of very successful alums, many of whom are in the Philadelphia area. And one way to get them to reach back out to young entrepreneurs is through alumni angel networks, so that you support either startups coming out of the university, or even grads who are a few years out who are doing startups. And I've seen that in Maryland. I've seen that in University of Wisconsin, surprisingly, has a very strong angel group that keeps some startups in that community, in Madison, Wisconsin, where you'd expect them to move to Chicago or whatever. So that's one mechanism that I don't know if it is in place here, but could work.
Yeah, in that vein, secondary or I guess it's tertiary markets who are doing things right. What other cities, again, maybe not New York, not Boston, not Silicon Valley, what other cities are you seeing do interesting things around both retaining college entrepreneurs, but also facilitating an even bigger startup ecosystem?
So I want to echo. We do see this a lot. University of Virginia set up an alumni venture fund. Boston College set up recently an alumni venture fund. Harvard is trying to do a bunch of things. Most of the job creation in the Massachusetts venture-backed community comes out of MIT in one way or another. To analogize what you had said about Penn, MIT is really the engine of creation, but Harvard is trying to do a lot more to change that and catch up. But a couple of cities that are doing some interesting things that just, some of these have to do with sort of public policy kinds of issues, but Detroit and Cincinnati are doing very interesting things with trying to create real entrepreneurial activity in regions that have other strengths. And I guess the effort is oldest in Detroit, and there's a lot of successful data. And one of the things that they have done is formed large fund of funds pools to invest in venture capital firms that at least will say they have an interest in the area. So they're investing for return, but they're investing in venture firms that will actually pay attention to a geography and combine that with a lot of other activities. And that's created a bunch of job creation and a bunch of value creation in Detroit for sure. And Cincinnati is emerging that way as well.
Yeah, Jeff, I saw you.
Yeah, so I mean, Spring Lake tends to invest in the later portion of the venture cycle, so we don't see as much of the real creation side of things. So usually we're seeing it when there's more proof points in play. But one common thing that we've seen on markets, be it Madison, I actually grew up in Wisconsin, so I can speak a little bit to that, and Cincinnati, which we've actually invested in successfully as well, has been areas that have been really true to the culture of that market. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about culture before, but I think we should probably restate it. Chicago, you would think, would have even a greater venture pool than it does. They've always had sort of that second city mentality to an extent, and it's been a little holding them back a little bit. And it's only when they started touting themselves and understanding what makes them strong that they really rose up a bit. You're seeing that in Cincinnati with the likes of leveraging the resources of all the consumer packaged goods companies down there. In Madison, leveraging a lot of the research and development work of the university there. That once you start understanding what you're strong at, and we talked a little bit about it, there's a lot of strengths around Philly that I think they just haven't quite either played up or been afraid, not afraid, but they need to be more puffing their chest out to say this is what we're good at.
Yeah, we're gonna hear more about health IT, which is obviously one of those sectors in the Philadelphia area that is seeing a lot of momentum actually after this panel. So we'll tune in for some cultural strengths for the Philadelphia area. Does anyone else want to offer any sort of case studies or lessons learned elsewhere that they've seen that you might want to impart to this room of investors and entrepreneurs?
I'll add one quick thing that I've seen in other regions, and it comes back to universities. Universities are not just a source of talent and a source of alumni that might be angels, but the third thing I've seen is the power of the endowments. I mean, you've got billions and billions of dollars of endowment dollars, here in Philadelphia, and I know in Boston, and I've seen in other regions, some of the biggest endowments. MIT, I think of in particular, has focused on, obviously they're trying to get returns, but also investing in funds that are going to be active in the Boston region. They see themselves as stewards of that community. And I don't know what role, Penn or Drexel or any of the universities around here has played in terms of their endowment investing in funds that are going to invest in entrepreneurs in the region, but I've seen that help drive, particularly Boston, but Atlanta has benefited from that as well.
I mean, I don't think I mentioned this, but not to underestimate the idea of importing people and having this be a fertile place for people to come. We've seen tremendous creation in the venture business by people that are immigrants to the U.S. building their companies. Our largest company at Sigma that's not yet a public company, Acquia, really was a transplant from Belgium, and now is employing, I guess, 500 people and growing at 100% a year on all different dimensions. And that's a very common experience. If you actually look at how much of the job creation of Boston venture-backed companies or of Valley venture-backed companies come from people that immigrated to the U.S., it's a very, very large number, a surprisingly large proportion. And so, just an example, I recently spoke to a delegation of entrepreneurs from London that were wanting to move to the States, to headquarter in the States, keep their development groups, in the UK, and they just happened to visit. I think it was Boston, New York, Chicago, and the Valley. And so, just making sure that Philadelphia is on that map, on that destination. There's no reason some of those folks wouldn't have been amazing to come here, better than coming and getting lost in the Valley.
Gotcha. And there is a delegation of Israeli tech companies in Philadelphia, maybe even in this room, who are here at the moment. With that, I did want to open it up to audience questions. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. I can't really see much, honestly, with the lights, but I'm going to try to do my best. I see a hand right here, sir. Please stand up and ask away.
From this gap, for instance, Maryland, there's a 50%
I'll go ahead and just restate the question for the benefit of the audience. That was Ben Goldberg. He wanted to ask the panel about tax policy or public policy, what Pennsylvania or Philadelphia could be doing similar to other states. Maryland was mentioned, Jersey was mentioned. How does tax policy, how does public policy influence and intersect with this conversation?
It's a little hard, from the New York perspective, it's a little hard to separate the policy from just the ecosystem and kind of what came first. But there's no question that there was some progressive policy around startup and tax credits for building small businesses in New York that the entire New York venture kind of community benefited from. Now, would the community have grown as rapidly as it did over the past 10 years without that? I don't know, but you could point to it and say it definitely helped.
Any other thoughts on how policy affects this conversation?
Again, I won't comment specifically on Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, but I mentioned this other company that we started with the technology team in Ottawa. Canada has very generous tax credits and tax refunds associated with hiring technical talent. So I think at the end of your tax filing year, then you actually get some sort of credit for your following year's taxes, which is could amount for a startup, especially in those early years, to millions of dollars. It's significant.
I think it's a great. I think I'm not a public policy expert by any stretch, but I think tax credits in areas where people are going to do investing anyway are generally a waste. But in a secondary market that's really trying to get its flywheel going, they're a very good idea. And we have two tangible examples in our portfolio. One was a company in New Haven that received about $7 million of tax credits in the mid-2000s. It was a very successful portfolio company of ours, went public. And that made a big difference. The company would have been founded there anyway. Whether it would have stayed in New Haven through its growth from 200 employees to 1,200 employees, it probably wouldn't, but for that tax credit. And actually, we're co-investors, our funds, in a company that started in Indiana, and some early tax credits really helped create a lot of jobs in the Indiana market as well. So I think for Pennsylvania, given all the issues that we're talking about today with why isn't the Philadelphia entrepreneurial ecosystem bigger, I think that would be on my short list. If I was trying to develop this market, go and try and get whatever city and state credits you can get.
Got it. Any other looking for questions? I have one right here. Stand up. That was Karen from Viewed, an entrepreneurial company here that's doing interesting things. She wanted to know just some of the differences between East and West Coast, especially as it relates to different funding amounts in a seed round versus a Series A, for instance.
I wish New York seed rounds looked like a couple $100,000. They don't. They look like, I'd say average kind of seed round that we see is between $2 and $5 million. And the truth is it's all, the nomenclature doesn't really matter. That used to be what people called a Series A. It's just changed names because those startups aren't fresh out of a PowerPoint raising $4 or $5 million. They're usually a little bit further along, and they usually raise some angel money before and a couple $100,000 there. So I think the progression hasn't necessarily changed. I think that the nomenclature has changed, and I do think that when you start talking about kind of from initial inception to kind of year 2, the amount of total money invested has grown, but it's really just a result of compressed timelines as opposed to larger rounds.
I mean, I would say the biggest differences between the coasts when it comes to investment size, valuations, and so on aren't necessarily in the seed round or the Series A or even the Series B. It's those Series C or MES rounds that could be twice or 3 times as large, led by West Coast investors, and at 2 or 3x the price. So obviously, that's to be taken advantage of. So for companies that are doing great, our companies are raising their Series Cs generally from Valley-based firms, and that would be, a typical recommendation for a company here as well.
I think the other difference that I've seen at the early stage is that in the Valley, sometimes if it's a second or third company by this entrepreneur and they've been successful before, they're willing to fund it themselves, or the founders are willing to fund it themselves for some period of time, get the company a little bit further along, maybe skip that seed round, or they'll do a seed a little bit later and allow the valuations or the valuation caps, if it's a convertible note, to be much higher than they otherwise would. And it's tough as a VC. You're sitting there you're sitting across the table from the guy who founded the company, and you're effectively competing as a source of funds for that company. It's a tough equation.
Well, I would say, having done this for 15 years, I'm seeing things out of the valley the last year or two that I hadn't seen since the first bubble in 99, 2000, in terms of the size of rounds, the valuation, and the speed with which they're being done, preemptively. We had a company that we invested in, Series A seed, whatever you want to call it. 12 months later, someone puts in a preemptive term sheet at 3 times the valuation, almost $100 million valuation for a company that's pre-revenue. That's getting a little out of hand out there, and the round sizes are getting crazy in terms of the amount of capital. Someone touched on it earlier, the amount of capital that's going into companies, because when something's hot right now, there's so much capital in the valley that it's very easy to raise large sums of money, and large sums of money sort of lead to high valuations, and it's not a good thing for the companies. It puts you in a very difficult position to succeed, and right now you're starting to see some of the public markets correct, and if that trend continues, a lot of those companies are going to be a tough spot. And I feel like the East Coast has been much more conservative, and that makes it sometimes tougher to raise money on the East Coast, but it also means, like in the first bubble, I think some of those companies will be more likely to ride through the downturns because they haven't taken way too much capital and spent it recklessly because it was available at very high prices. When you have cheap capital, unfortunately you spend it, and that's putting some companies in a tough spot. So it's obviously an East Coast bias, but I like the way we do it here.
Philip, I wanted to press you for a few quick examples of sectors that are overrated and underrated in this moment. If you had to pick one or two of each, what would you say?
So I would say network security right now tends to, if there's any area that I'll use the bad B word bubble, would be network security. Just so you look at some of the public market valuations for companies that are and multiples of revenue, it's really things you haven't seen since 2000. Now, some of that's corrected. The last 3 months, a lot of those companies have lost more than half their market cap. So I think that's, your FireEye and Perva, so forth. So I think there's been some correction there. But that's the sector where we see out of the valley the highest, pre-revenue valuations have been around security, because it's obviously, it is a very big issue, and people are focused on it. But I think sometimes excitement gets ahead of reality. Underrated markets, we've had some great successes in the intersection of hardware and life sciences. So we're not drug pharma guys or anything like that, but you look at the cost of gene sequencing, it's been coming down by a factor of 4 every year. It's twice as fast as Moore's Law, and you say, well, that's opening up a whole lot of opportunities. And for tech investors like us, who are used to doing hardware and semiconductors, semiconductors are entering that market in a big way, and I don't think you've seen a lot of investment dollars follow that.
Interesting. Shimez, I'll let you chime in. I saw you wanted to get a thought in there.
I was going to comment about the West Coast funding, but I'll actually comment on the sectors. I think anything that you can compare to Uber is overpriced right now. Anything to do with the sharing economy. Yeah, up until last month, anything in mobile payments before Apple made their Apple Pay announcements. I think it is interesting. I'm being kind of facetious, but I do think that that there are these very hot areas, but they're also very unstable. And so anyone who's an entrepreneur knows it takes years to build a successful company. And no matter what value you raise capital at, you don't cash out until the company's very far along. So, it's relevant in the sense that I'd rather have more capital, less dilution, but I don't get to take any of that money home until I build a successful business. But we do know several companies that have headed out to the West Coast because they think that it's just an easier place to raise capital. And the only thing I'd say is, in many ways it is, but the streets definitely are not paved with gold, and there's a very efficient culling mechanism out there. So what I find with a lot of the funds out there, they'll invest at a high valuation, but actually a relatively modest amount of money, given the fund size, and then they'll torture these companies for a year, see if there's some there, and if there's not, you're gone. So it's not a patient source of capital, although it can be an exuberant source of capital.
Real quick there.
I have a question out here.
It's easier to raise money in the valley if you're from the valley. So I think you touched on it, Louis. The guys who are repeat entrepreneurs are the ones who are getting these very big rounds and so forth. You know, the money follows that talent that's been proven before. You know, the idea that you're coming from Philadelphia, if you listen to this conversation, you say, hey, I need to get on a plane to San Francisco tomorrow and go raise money at high valuations and they'll throw money at me. It's really, that's not the case. It's really the entrepreneurs who've had success in the Valley who are getting that kind of excitement.
Got it. Question at the microphone.
Yeah, I have a question. I heard one of you talk about a collaboration between nonprofits and working with VCs. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm the founder of a nonprofit, a public charity called Crosslink Medical Resources. It's a patient advocacy organization working in healthcare IT, and I want to know how that collaboration might work between, working with us and, developing innovation and technology within a nonprofit.
John, I think that might have been you.
Yeah, I can try to take that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's hard because for-profits have their own mission and not-for-profits have their own mission, generally those missions can be distinct. But what I found is if you can have things where you have nonprofit folks and for-profit folks at the table working together for some shared mission, usually it's a not-for-profit mission, and then working together and doing something great, then those relationships translate outside that entity and actually then lead to other good things. So an example with Greenlight, we bring a program to Philadelphia called Single Stop that works at the community college at Philadelphia in all kinds of amazing ways, and it was a coalition of board members and people that helped bring that program for profit and not for profit. And as those relationships were built and as that program was nested, those relationships traveled to other things. And in fact, some of the folks got involved in supporting some of the various nonprofits and so on. So how to break down the barriers, how to get people working together on projects and things, and then those take a life of their own. That would be my big picture answer.
We had two questions over here, sir. The question being, will the relative gap between Philly and some of the bigger markets in 3 years, is that gap going to shrink or will it continue to widen? Who wants to take it? Shamez will not take it.
I'll tell you one thing, it won't be determined by how much Series A and B capital there is here. That point was made earlier. Because again, just look at the example of Boston. This last quarter, Q3, it was $900 million of venture capital that was invested. But a ton of that was West Coast capital investing in companies like, Acquia or Interactions or, tremendous companies locally in Boston. And I think that same thing will be true here, that the bulk of the capital will be coming from outside the region into those Series C and D companies. And the question is how, those companies that are being formed now, that are being built, are they going to stay here? Are they going to attract that kind of capital? I don't know the marketplace well enough to know for sure. I just don't.
And that may be the Curelates, the RJ Metrics, the Monotates of the world here in Philadelphia. But Matt wanted to chime in.
No, I think that's exactly right. The gap will close if there are great companies here where investors feel like they can put significant dollars. Because the gap is not the Series A, it's somebody coming in and writing a $50 or $100 million check into some of these companies.
Got it. I saw another question back that way. Please stand up. So that was Caroline, an entrepreneur who also wears the hat running an accelerator. She had a question about sectors specific to the Philadelphia sector with a lot of interest and activity around health. I think the question was, where do you see the next big raise coming from out of that sector? Was that the question?
Yeah.
That's funding, again, entering the life sciences sector. Great.
I can comment on that a little bit, just because most of the companies actually I've been looking at in the Philadelphia area have actually been in healthcare IT. So not to merge the two of them together there for you, but I did. The fact of the matter there is, if you look at the base of companies in the Philadelphia area, there's, you got Aetna with a big operation down in Bluebell, you got Magellan on the behavioral health side, now part of Aetna. You have a bunch of historical evidence around healthcare services. So that's definitely an area that I think anybody on the panel here would be looking at. On the pure life sciences side, quite frankly, that is a different animal on how it's invested from both an investor perspective and also an entrepreneur perspective. That said, there really should be more done in the Philadelphia area. I think what Boston's done very well, and John spoke to it earlier, ton of lab space available. The biggest detriment or biggest hindrance towards a life sciences company starting up is access to lab space. The most expensive real estate in Boston is in East Cambridge. It used to be all warehouses on the far side of the MIT campus. Now that's going for $75 up to $90 a square foot now. And that's not something that's readily, at least as far as to my knowledge, is readily accessible in the downtown Philadelphia area. That's probably changing, but to the extent you can get that word out, you can get ready access to lab space, you already have the large pharma companies in your backyard. They're looking, the new model is that they invest earlier on and take more of that risk. That really should be something Philadelphia is looking at, but unfortunately it's not my area of expertise.
All right, we're gonna have to wrap it up. I'm gonna ask for one more question, then we'll shut it down. Right here, front row, sir.
Yes. Hi, I'm Austin Helm from Collaborations, and I was wondering, can you explain the logic behind companies like Snapchat who demonstrate traction with users but haven't demonstrated the ability to generate a dollar, why they get $10 billion valuations, and at what point they'll start to lose clout with investors?
Question had to do with high valuations for companies that have no proven track record of generating revenue. What's the science, what's the art behind these high valuations that come to a company like Snapchat, for instance?
Well, without commenting specifically on Snapchat, when you look at companies like Twitter and Facebook, people were making these kinds of calculations about, with this kind of audience footprint, with this kind of viewership, what might revenues be? And it turns out that they actually were remarkably on target about those things, because the private market values ended up being really representative of what the public market values ultimately were when the thing started really generating revenue. I think, what is Twitter now at $350 million a quarter of revenue or something like that? And of course, everybody's guessing, 4 years ago as a private company when it's when it's not revenue generating at all. So I actually think that historically the VC community has done a pretty good job with that, other than the crazy times from sort of 98 to 2000. It looks to outsiders like maybe there's a bubble around some of these companies, but time will tell. Other people may have more knowledgeable comments than that.
So I agree with those comments, and again, I won't comment on the specific companies, but I think the other part of your question is, what causes these valuations to change, and all these high valuations are not only predicated on monetization, as John described, but they're also predicated on growth. And I think I don't know if you saw in the past 24 hours, I think it was Twitter's stock price coming down because the growth in users wasn't as high as they expected. So if you're looking for what breaks that cycle, it's the growth isn't as strong, or they're not monetizing, the CPMs are not as strong in some of these advertising models, and the trajectory, instead of going like this, maybe going something like that, and so then the valuations change. Whether it corrects for some fairly hefty valuations today, and to what extent, I'm not sure.
I'll just say one other thing. Some of these valuations are just very tricky. You think about, well, what can a company monetize on its own? So what's that? the example of the Facebook acquisition of WhatsApp. Well, what's WhatsApp worth on its own, or what about if it's attached to somebody else's monetization engine? And that's also the tricky thing, because in one way, let's say it could be worth very little in somebody's hands that can't monetize it. But if somebody could monetize it to the tunes of $1 billion a year, $800 million of profit a year, all of a sudden it becomes way more valuable. So it's really hard.
And yeah, and just the concept of being able to target advertising. So you look at what the internet's done to newspaper advertising, and you sort of look at all the other sectors of advertising, some of which are related to Comcast businesses, and you just think the effectiveness of targeting, how that allows you to deploy as an advertiser, allows you to deploy your dollars a little bit more effectively. So to the extent that some of these new companies can, they're not necessarily going to replace the market spend, but they're actually going to shrink it and just make it a lot more efficient. So people are, clearly willing to pay, some of that money that they've saved, to these new platforms.
We're going to leave it there. Just wanted to thank this wonderful panel for everything that they've shared here. Join me in applauding our VC panel to kick off the day. Thank you so much.
So we at RCCB Law want to again thank Zach and the panel for a very insightful discussion and spending some time with us this afternoon. I think we learned a lot of new things, or at least I did, particularly the continued opportunities and in addition to the challenges that we have here in Philadelphia. Some of the facts that were discussed, that the leading institution for startups in New York is the University of Pennsylvania, shows that we have a tremendous opportunity here to try to capture some of that activity that's going to other places. And as the panel said, they're not investing in places, but they're investing in people and companies. There's a tremendous amount of talent here, and institutions and large companies to back that up.